In 2017, an unassuming plot of land became the focal point of an archaeological revelation. It was located near the outskirts of an old plantation in Southern America. Broken pottery, old tools, and shards of glass were discovered initially. The excavation unearthed the remains of a slave breeding farm owned by the very founding father of America. On further exploration, the site showed signs of cramped living quarters, storage spaces that suggested surplus food and provisions, and areas that seemed to be segregated based on gender. There were artifacts found near the living quarters that revealed personal items like hair combs, buttons, and pieces of clothing. The extensive research uncovered letters that belonged to an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings. She resided in one of those quarters. Her 6 children were born into bondage, and their father was none other than Thomas Jefferson. This evidence suggested that the land was not just slave quarters, but an organized system of a slave breeding farm. Before exploring the dark past of slave breeding associated with Jefferson, we must understand how slave breeding worked in America. Slave breeding farms were places where enslaved African Americans were forced to have children. These farms didn't operate like traditional farms. Instead, they were driven by a horrific process that treated people as property. 2 of the largest such farms were in Richmond and Maryland's Eastern Shore. Richmond, a bustling port city, exported between 10,000 to 20,000 slaves a month. Slavery was Virginia's main domestic crop. Slaves were offloaded in states like New Orleans. They weren't from Africa, but were shipped from Richmond around Florida. The primary goal at these farms was to increase the population of enslaved people. When the international slave trade started to face opposition, slave owners sought other ways to sustain their workforce. They turned to the forced reproduction of their enslaved people. The owners considered the children of the enslaved people as their property, to be used as labor or sold for profit. They were ripped away from their mothers at a young age, sometimes only a few months old, to be sold off or raised separately, which was another cruel manifestation of the dehumanizing nature of these farms. The living conditions within these farms were nothing short of abysmal. Slaves were housed in cramped, ill-ventilated quarters, often with little to no regard for sanitation or basic human needs. Privacy was a luxury they could not afford. Men, women, and children were crammed together, separated only by rudimentary partitions that did little more than demarcate sleeping areas. These sleeping quarters were typically lined with straw or rough-hewn pallets. Blankets, if provided at all, were scarce and threadbare. Slaves were expected to work tirelessly throughout the day, and these uncomfortable sleeping conditions provided little relief or opportunity for rest. The food provided was barely enough to keep them alive, let alone healthy. Slaves were rationed meager portions of cornmeal, fatback, and occasionally scraps of meat, which was a diet severely lacking in essential nutrients. Hunger was a constant companion, as was disease. Malnutrition, combined with poor sanitation, led to outbreaks of illnesses like cholera. Women and girls bore an additional burden of suffering. They were subjected to systematic sexual exploitation, forced into relationships for the sole purpose of producing more slaves. The emotional trauma and physical toll of these forced pregnancies were profound, yet they were given no choice, no voice, and no control over their own bodies. Now that you've learned about the harsh conditions and exploitation in slave breeding farms, you might naturally assume that Thomas Jefferson, known for his advocacy for liberty, would have taken actions to address these injustices. But the actual truth might surprise you and presents a far more complex picture. For Jefferson, slaves were a source of wealth. Jefferson wanted Virginia, his home state, to be the top seller of slaves, beating out competition from South Carolina and other states. He owned a vast plantation, Monticello, where hundreds of slaves worked. He didn't just own slaves, he bred, bought, and sold them. Hundreds of people lived in Monticello, where their lives were tightly controlled and their freedoms were denied. For the enslaved individuals, the working conditions were often harsh. Their workdays were long and tiring. They usually started work at dawn and ending at dusk, and this continued 6 days a week. The jobs that the enslaved people at Monticello carried out were many and varied, covering nearly every aspect of plantation life. In the fields and gardens, they planted and harvested crops like wheat, corn, and tobacco. This was grueling work, done by hand and often in harsh weather conditions. Another important role on the plantation was working in the blacksmith shop. Here, enslaved people would make and repair tools, horseshoes, and other essential items for the plantation. The work was physically demanding, requiring strength and skill, and the conditions were often hot and dangerous. Some enslaved people were also put to work in Jefferson's nailery. This was a site where young enslaved boys, some as young as 10, would make nails from raw iron. This work was particularly hard and dangerous. The boys had to heat the iron until it was made soft, then hammer it into shape. Any mistake could result in severe burns or injuries. Inside Jefferson's home, slaves were responsible for the domestic chores. This included cooking, cleaning, and laundry. Enslaved women often took on these roles, and they also cared for Jefferson's children. They were at the beck and call of the Jefferson family, day and night. The physical demands of these roles were significant, and the labor was often performed under the threat of punishment. Living conditions were also difficult for those kept at Monticello. The vast majority of the enslaved men and women lived in small, cramped log cabins known as Mulberry Row. These cabins lacked proper insulation and were often crowded with multiple individuals or families sharing a single room. The food provided to the enslaved was also minimal, usually consisting of cornmeal, salt pork, or fish, and occasionally some garden vegetables. In 2017, archaeologists found evidence of Sally Hemings' living quarters. This room, tucked away in the south wing of the house, had been converted into a restroom in the 1940s. When archaeologists dug deeper, they found original features from Hemings' time. Besides the living quarters, the excavations have also shed light on the conditions of the farm. They have found remnants of the workshops, smokehouses, and other structures that were part of the plantation's daily operation. These findings paint a picture of the hard work that enslaved people would have carried out, from blacksmithing and carpentry to food preservation and other forms of labor. The investigation further discovered that Sally Hemings was the mother of Jefferson's children. She was an enslaved woman owned by Thomas Jefferson. Sally was born into slavery because her mother, Betty Hemings, was also enslaved. There is a common belief that Sally's father was John Wales, who was also the father of Jefferson's wife, Martha. This would make Sally and Martha half-sisters. Even though Sally and Martha shared a father, Sally was treated as property, not family, because of her mother's enslaved status. Sally Hemings was brought to live at Monticello as a young child. She was among several slaves who were inherited by Martha and Jefferson after John Wales died. At Monticello, Sally served as a maid and was assigned to look after Jefferson's daughters. The main piece of evidence is a historical report by one of Sally's sons, Madison Hemings, who claimed in a newspaper review in 1873 that Jefferson was his father and his siblings Harriet, Beverly, and Aston Hemings. A DNA study conducted in 1998 showed a genetic link between the male Jefferson line and descendants of Sally Hemings' youngest son, Aston Hemings, giving weight to the claims made by Madison Hemings. According to Madison Hemings, his siblings, Beverly and Harriet, left Monticello and passed into white society, living the rest of their lives as white individuals. Madison and Aston were freed in Jefferson's will, and they both moved to Ohio, where they lived as free men. Aston later changed his last name to Jefferson, and his descendants lived as members of the white community. These stories present an unknown side of slavery, race, and family during Jefferson's time. While some say Jefferson was against slavery, his actions speak louder than his words. He owned over 600 slaves in his lifetime, but only freed 7. He even once said that a woman who had a child every 2 years was more profitable than the best farmland. This cruel aspect of slavery varied widely, but it highlights the immense suffering of enslaved people. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed this episode, then please like, share, and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and keep watching.